September 6, 1976. 200 miles of open ocean. The fuel gauge was touching zero. Lieutenant Victor Belenko gripped the control stick of his MiG-25 Foxbat with hands that had gone numb 20 minutes ago. Below him, the Sea of Japan stretched endlessly in every direction. Dark water, white caps, nothing but waves between Soviet airspace and freedom. 50 feet of altitude, maybe less. At this speed, at this height, one mistake meant death. The aircraft would hit the water and disintegrate before he could even think about ejecting. The cockpit was shaking so violently his vision blurred. This machine was never designed to fly this low, this fast, this heavy with fuel in the final moments before the tanks ran dry. The stick fought him with every adjustment. Metal groaned and screamed around him. Heat radiated through the steel skin of the fuselage, turning the cockpit into an oven. His flight suit was soaked through. Sweat ran into his eyes. He couldn't wipe it away. Both hands stayed locked on the controls. 12 minutes. That was all the time he had left. 12 minutes to reach Japan or die trying. His right hand moved to the breast pocket of his flight suit. Inside, wrapped in plastic to protect it from the sweat, was a single photograph. 3 by 4 inches, crumpled at the edges from being touched too many times over 3 months of planning. His son Dmitri, 6 years old, smiling because his mother had promised ice cream after the picture. The only image Victor owned of his boy, the only piece of his family he would carry into exile. He thought about Dmitri sleeping in their apartment that morning, peaceful, unaware. By now, the boy would be awake. His mother would be making breakfast, black bread and weak tea. The same breakfast they ate every morning, the same breakfast Victor had eaten for the last 10 years of his life. And when the knock came at the door, when the KGB arrived to tell Ludmila that her husband had betrayed the Soviet Union, what would they tell the boy? What lies would they feed his son about the father who had simply vanished into the sky? Victor looked down at the waves again. So close, so fast. One mistake, and none of it would matter. The radio had been silent for 8 minutes. He had switched it off when the threat started. Return to heading or you will be fired upon. They had scrambled interceptors. He knew the protocol. He had flown intercepts himself as part of the 513th Fighter Regiment. Standard procedure for an aircraft leaving Soviet airspace without authorization, warning, then weapons-free. Somewhere behind him, other MiG-25s were climbing hunting, searching for aircraft number 31. His former squadron mates, men he had trained with, men who would shoot him down without hesitation if they found him. But Victor had one advantage. He knew this aircraft better than anyone in his regiment. He knew exactly how low he could push it, how fast he could run, and how the aircraft performed when flown beyond every limitation in the manual. The other pilots would never drop this low. They would follow procedure, maintain safe altitude, try to intercept from above. By the time they figured out he was hugging the waves, he would be in Japanese airspace. If he made it that far, if the engines held, if the fuel lasted, if. Victor pushed the throttle forward another fraction. The engine note climbed higher. The vibration intensified. Mach 1.2, Mach 1.5. The air intake temperature gauge was redlining. He ignored it. Everything in this cockpit was beyond limits now, including him. Ahead through the vibrating canopy, he could see land, a dark smudge on the horizon, Japan. It looked impossibly far away, and yet closer with every second. The northern island of Hokkaido, Hakodate Airport, a civilian field. Not a military base, that was deliberate. Landing at a military installation would trigger an immediate armed response. Soviet fighters closing in, Japanese fighters, scrambling missiles in the air, chaos in the diplomatic channels. But a civilian airport, confusion. Precious minutes of confusion before anyone understood what was happening. Enough time to surrender, enough time to request asylum before the Soviets could demand his return. The plan was simple. It had to be simple. Complex plans failed. Simple plans executed with total commitment had a chance. Get across the ocean, find the airport, land, surrender, request asylum, survive. That was it. That was the entire plan that would cost him everything he had ever known and save his life. The dark smudge on the horizon was growing larger now. Definitely land, definitely Japan. The fuel gauge needle was bouncing against the bottom of the scale. Red warning lights flickered across the instrument panel. fuel pressure dropping. The engines were about to start drinking fumes instead of liquid. When that happened, they would flame out. Both engines would die within seconds of each other. The aircraft would become a 30-ton glider with the aerodynamic properties of a brick. At this altitude, he would have maybe 15 seconds before impact. Victor's jaw clenched. Not yet. Not when freedom was 10 miles away. 9 miles. 8. He could see details on the coastline now. Trees, buildings, roads. The outline of Hakodate City spreading along the harbor. The airport would be on the northern edge. He had studied maps for 3 months, memorized every detail, every runway, every approach. He had never seen this airport with his own eyes, but he knew it better than some of the Soviet fields he had landed at dozens of times. The engine note changed, a subtle drop in pitch, fuel starvation beginning. Seconds left, not minutes. 6 miles. 5. The coastline was rushing toward him now. He pulled back on the stick, trading speed for altitude. The nose came up. The aircraft climbed. 100 feet, 200, 500, gaining height for the approach. He needed to be high enough to glide in if the engines quit low enough that Japanese air defense radar might not immediately classify him as a threat. 4 miles. 3. There. The airport. 2 runways forming an X pattern. The longer runway aligned northeast to southwest. Perfect. He banked left, lining up. The engines were coughing now. Intermittent surges. The fuel pressure gauge showed nothing. He was flying on vapor and luck. 2 miles, Victor reached for the landing gear lever, extended the gear. 3 heavy clunks as the wheels locked into position. Massive drag increase. The aircraft slowed dramatically, airspeed dropping through 400 knots. 350, 300. The engines died, both of them simultaneously exactly as he had known they would. The cockpit went quiet except for the rush of wind over the airframe and the whistle of air through the intakes. No thrust, no power, just momentum and gravity. 1 mile. Victor had done this calculation 100 times in his head. Glide ratio, sink rate, distance to runway. The math said he would make it. Barely. The math also said that hundreds of things could go wrong in the next 90 seconds. He ignored the math. There was no turning back now. There had been no turning back since the moment he pushed the throttle forward over Soviet territory 40 minutes ago. The runway was directly ahead. Too high, he was coming in too steep. Victor pushed the nose down, increasing the descent rate, bleeding off altitude. The aircraft was heavy unresponsive without engine power to feed the hydraulics. Everything felt sluggish, delayed. He made corrections by instinct more than instrument reference. Half a mile. Air traffic control would be screaming on the radio. Emergency vehicles scrambling. Japanese self-defense force fighters launching. Americans calling Tokyo. Soviets calling Tokyo. Everyone calling everyone. Panic rippling through every government within 1,000 miles. But inside this cockpit, there was only silence and the sound of wind and Victor's own breathing sharp and fast inside the oxygen mask. Quarter mile. The runway threshold passed beneath him. He was committed now. The wheels would touch Japanese soil in seconds. Either the landing gear would hold or it would collapse. Either he would walk away or die in a fireball of twisted metal and burning fuel vapor. No middle ground, no second chances. Victor pulled back on the stick. Flare. The nose came up. The sink rate decreased. He felt the aircraft settle heavy and fast. Impact. The main wheels hit first, hard. The entire airframe shuddered. The nose gear slammed down a second later. More shaking. Brutal, violent deceleration. Victor stood on the brakes. The wheels locked. Rubber screamed against concrete. The aircraft skidded, sliding more than rolling. 30 tons of Soviet interceptors trying to stop from 300 knots with no thrust reversers, no drag chute, nothing but friction and prayer. The end of the runway was approaching fast. Too fast. Victor could see grass beyond the pavement, trees beyond the grass. He kept maximum pressure on the brakes. Metal grinding. Something in the landing gear was failing. He could feel it through the rudder pedals. 200 knots. 150. 100. 50. The aircraft rolled to a stop 300 feet from the end of the runway. Victor sat motionless in the cockpit for 5 seconds. His hands were still gripping the control stick and throttles with enough force to make his fingers ache. He consciously released them, flexed his hands. They were shaking. He was alive. He was in Japan. He had done it. Through the canopy, he could see vehicles approaching. Japanese airport security. Police. Flashing lights. People running. He reached up, pulled the canopy release. The mechanism worked. The canopy hinged open. Fresh air rushed in cool and clean after the superheated stink of the cockpit. Victor pulled off his helmet and oxygen mask. His hair was matted with sweat. His face felt sunburned from the radiant heat. He stood in the cockpit. Slowly. His legs were unsteady. 40 brutal minutes of high-G maneuvering, 40 minutes of adrenaline, 40 minutes of knowing that death was one mechanical failure away. His body was only now starting to realize it might actually survive. Japanese police surrounded the aircraft, guns drawn, shouting in a language he did not understand. Victor raised his hands above his head, high, palms open, universal gesture of surrender. He climbed down from the cockpit, moving carefully, keeping his hands visible. His boots touched Japanese concrete, foreign soil, free soil. He had crossed the line. Everything behind him was gone. Everything ahead was unknown. One of the police officers approached, weapon aimed at center mass, shouting commands. Victor kept his hands raised. He knew exactly 3 words of Japanese, and none of them were useful right now. But he knew 3 words of English. He had practiced them every night for 3 months. 3 words that would change his life forever. He spoke them clearly, loudly, so there could be no misunderstanding. I request asylum. The police officer stopped shouting, looked confused, turned to his colleague. More Japanese conversation that Victor could not follow. But the tone had changed, not aggressive now, uncertain. The guns were still pointed at him, but fingers had moved off triggers. Someone was running across the tarmac. A man in a suit. Not police. Airport official, maybe. He reached the group out of breath, speaking rapidly in Japanese. The police officer responded, pointed at Victor, pointed at the aircraft. The man in the suit looked at the MiG-25 for the first time, really looked at it, and his face went pale. He turned to Victor, spoke in broken English. You are Soviet pilot. Victor nodded. You want asylum, America? Victor nodded again. The man in the suit pulled out a radio, started speaking rapidly, making calls, lots of calls. Victor could hear the urgency in his voice, even without understanding the words. This was bigger than airport security could handle, bigger than local police. This was international crisis material unfolding in real time on a civilian runway in northern Japan. Within 20 minutes, there were 50 vehicles on the tarmac. Within an hour, American embassy officials arrived. Within 2 hours, Soviet diplomats were demanding immediate return of the aircraft and pilot. Within 6 hours, Viktor Belenko was in protective custody, being moved to an undisclosed location, while the Japanese government tried to navigate impossible diplomatic waters between 2 superpowers who both wanted what had just fallen into their lap. If you lived through the Cold War, you remember the moment when news like this would break on the evening news. The shock, the fear, the questions about what Soviet defectors knew and what it meant for American security. What did you feel when you heard about incidents like this? Share your memories in the comments below. But standing there on the runway with his hands still raised and his old life burning behind him like the fuel he had left scattered across 200 miles of open ocean, Victor allowed himself one thought that had nothing to do with diplomacy or international incidents or intelligence coups. He thought about his son, about Dmitri waking up that morning in their small apartment, about the moment when his wife would realize Victor was not coming home, about the lies the boy would be told, about the years of separation that stretched ahead like another ocean wider than the one he had just crossed. The price of freedom, Victor had learned, was not paid once. It was paid every day in every moment of missing the life you left behind. But standing there on Japanese concrete with free air in his lungs and armed men surrounding him, who would protect rather than imprison him, Victor knew he would pay that price. He would pay it gladly, because his son would grow up in a world where he knew, even if only as a distant memory, that his father had chosen freedom over fear, that his father had chosen to risk everything rather than accept the slow death of living a lie. That was worth any price. That was worth crossing any ocean. That morning, as Victor Belenko stood on that runway with the September sun climbing into a clear sky and his life dividing forever into before and after, he did not yet know what American intelligence would discover when they examined his aircraft. He did not know about the laughter that would echo through CYA briefing rooms. He did not know about the nickname Steel Pig that would spread through the intelligence community like a virus. He did not know that his defection would become one of the most significant intelligence operations of the entire Cold War. He did not know that the crude, heavy, obsolete-looking aircraft behind him would teach the United States military lessons that would reshape American defense policy for the next 50 years. All he knew was that he had made it across the ocean, and whatever came next, he would face it as a free man. But to understand the desperation that drove Victor to risk everything that morning, we need to go back 3 months to the moment when a simple breakfast changed the course of history. May 14th, 1976, 0600 hours, Chuguyevka Air Base in the Soviet Far East. The officer's mess was exactly as depressing as every other morning Victor had eaten there for the past 3 years. The building was concrete block construction, painted institutional green 20 years ago and never repainted. Cracks ran through the plaster like rivers on a map. The heating system clanked and wheezed, but provided minimal warmth during the brutal winters. The tables were scarred wood, dark with decades of use and abuse. The air smelled of boiled cabbage, black bread, and the particular mix of sweat and tobacco that characterized every Soviet military facility Victor had ever seen. He sat at his usual table near the window, not because the view was pleasant. It was not. Just more concrete buildings in the distant fence line topped with barbed wire. But because the window table was furthest from the corner where the senior officers congregated, and Victor preferred to eat in relative peace rather than listen to the endless political posturing that accompanied every meal. Breakfast was the same as yesterday, the same as last week, the same as every morning for the past 10 years of Victor's service in the Soviet Air Force. Black bread, dense and slightly sour, 2 slices exactly. Rationed, boiled potatoes. Cold. 3 of them small ones, their skins still on because peeling vegetables was wasteful. A thin pat of butter that looked more like margarine and probably was. Weak tea in a glass cup with a metal holder, the tea so pale you could see through it to the scratches in the glass. Victor ate mechanically. Taste was irrelevant. This was fuel, calories. Enough to fly a morning training mission and return without the trembling weakness that came from genuine hunger, which he had experienced enough times to never want to experience again. Across the table, Captain Yuri Petrov was talking. Yuri was always talking. Today's topic was his new apartment in Moscow. Not at the base, in Moscow itself. A reward from the party for dedicated service and ideological reliability. 2 rooms, Yuri said, gesturing with a piece of bread. Real rooms, not like these barracks. A separate kitchen, private bathroom. And the building has hot water 4 days a week. 4 days, Victor. Can you imagine? Victor did not respond. He had learned that Yuri's monologues did not require audience participation. They would continue regardless. Of course, Yuri continued, lowering his voice slightly, I had to provide certain information to the political officer. Just confirming things that were already known. Security measures, you understand. But the party rewards loyalty. There it was, the casual admission that Victor had been waiting for since Yuri started bragging about the apartment. Certain information meant informing on fellow officers. Things already known meant fabricating evidence or exaggerating innocent comments into political crimes. The party rewards loyalty meant Yuri had sold his integrity for 2 rooms and a private bathroom. Victor took another bite of black bread. It tasted like sawdust. You should consider it, Yuri said, looking at Victor directly now. A man with your record, your skills. If you demonstrated proper ideological commitment, there could be opportunities. Advancement. Better housing for your family. Your son could attend better schools. For just a moment, Victor imagined it. Imagined saying yes. Imagined reporting to the political officer. Making up stories about other pilots. Whispering suspicions. Trading the lives and careers of men he flew with for an apartment with hot water and better rations for Dmitri. The taste of sawdust bread became ash in his mouth. I will consider it, Victor lied, because that was what you did. You lied, you agreed, you smiled and nodded, and said whatever words would make the conversation end so you could return to the only honest thing left in your life, which was flying. Yuri smiled satisfied, returned to describing his new apartment in exhaustive detail. Victor stopped listening. Through the window he could see the flight line. Rows of MiG-25 interceptors parked in their revetments. Massive aircraft even at this distance. Twin tails stabbing skyward. Angular, brutal, purposeful. The most secret weapon system in the Soviet arsenal. The aircraft that had terrified NATO for 10 years. Victor had been flying them for 3 years as part of the 513th Fighter Regiment. He knew every system, every limitation, every quirk of their design. He knew that Western intelligence believed the MiG-25 was a technological marvel, a super fighter that could outfly anything America possessed. He knew the truth was more complicated, more interesting, and completely classified. But sitting in that freezing mess hall eating cold potatoes and listening to Yuri brag about betraying his fellow officers for a better apartment, Victor realized something that crystallized with sudden, absolute clarity. He did not want to spend the rest of his life eating this breakfast. He did not want to watch his son grow up in a system where success required betrayal and survival required lies. He did not want to become like Yuri, comfortable, rewarded, dead inside. And for the first time, Victor allowed himself to think the thought that had been growing in the dark corners of his mind for months, the thought that was treasonous even in silence. He could leave. He could take his aircraft and fly to Japan and request asylum and never eat cold potatoes in a concrete block mess hall ever again. The thought terrified him. The thought exhilarated him. The thought would not leave him alone. Victor finished his breakfast in silence while Yuri continued talking about apartments and party loyalty and all the wonderful rewards that came from selling your soul in small, careful increments. And Victor began to plan. 3 months of planning came down to one morning, September 6, 1976, 0530 hours. Victor's apartment at Chuguyevka Air Base. He woke before the alarm, had barely slept. How could you sleep the night before you abandoned everything you had ever known? How could you close your eyes, knowing that when you opened them again, the clock would start counting down to the moment when your life split permanently into before and after? The apartment was silent, except for his wife's breathing in the bed beside him and the distant sound of a truck engine somewhere on the base. Victor lay still for a long moment, listening to those ordinary sounds, trying to memorize them. The creak of the mattress springs, the whistle of wind through the gap in the window frame that he had never gotten around to fixing, the radiator ticking as it cooled in the pre-dawn darkness. Ordinary sounds, the acoustic texture of a life he would never return to. He rose carefully, trying not to wake Ludmila. She stirred slightly, but did not open her eyes. Better that way. Better that their last conversation remained the mundane exchange from the night before about needing to buy bread and whether Dmitri's shoes were getting too small. Normal words, safe words, nothing that would seem suspicious when the KGB came asking what her husband's final words had been. Victor dressed in the dark, his flight suit hung on a hook by the door where he always left it. Standard Soviet Air Force issue. Olive drab, worn soft from 3 years of use. Pockets for checklist cards and pencils, and the small personal items a pilot carried. He checked those pockets now by feel. Identification papers, military card, the small photograph of Dmitri wrapped in plastic. Everything else he was leaving behind. The bathroom was down the hall, shared with 3 other families in the building. Victor walked quietly, his boots barely making sound on the wooden floor. He washed his face with cold water. The hot water had been shut off for maintenance 2 weeks ago and might not return for another month. That was normal. Everything broke in Soviet housing, and nothing got fixed with any urgency. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror above the sink. 29 years old, dark hair cut military short, lean face with the beginnings of stress lines around the eyes. The face of a man who had learned to keep his thoughts hidden and his mouth shut and his loyalty visible and his doubts buried so deep that sometimes he almost forgot they existed. This would be the last time he saw this face in this mirror as a Soviet officer. The next time he looked in a mirror, he would be a defector, a traitor, a man without a country. Victor returned to the apartment. Ludmila was awake now, moving in the kitchen area, the smell of weak tea and toasted black bread. She looked up when he entered. "You have a flight today." Training mission, standard intercept practice over the sea. Be careful. Those were her words every time he flew. Be careful. As if being careful mattered when you were strapping yourself into a machine designed to fly 3 times the speed of sound at altitudes where a pressure suit failure meant death in seconds. But she said it anyway because that was what wives said to husbands who flew dangerous aircraft for a living. I will, he replied. The same answer he always gave. The lie that both of them needed to maintain the illusion of safety. She poured tea, set it on the small table. Victor sat, drank. The tea was almost colorless, barely flavored. They were rationing the good tea for Dmitri. Children needed nutrition more than adults. That was what Ludmila said. Victor did not argue. Their son was still asleep in the smaller room. Victor could see him through the open door, curled under a thin blanket, 6 years old, growing fast. His shoes were getting too small. Ludmila was right about that. They would need to requisition new ones from the base quartermaster, which meant waiting in line for 2 hours and filling out forms, and probably being told there were no shoes in Dimitri's size and to come back next month. Except Victor would not be here next month. He stood, walked to his son's room, stood in the doorway watching the boy sleep. Dimitri's face was peaceful, innocent, unaware that his father was about to do something that would mark the boy for the rest of his life. The son of a traitor. That would be Dimitri's identity from this day forward. Teachers would know, classmates would know. The stain would follow him through school, through military service, if he was even allowed to serve, through every job application and housing request and marriage proposal. Victor had thought about this every day for 3 months. The cost to his son, the price Dmitri would pay for his father's choice. And every time Victor came to the same conclusion. Better to grow up as the son of a traitor in a system that was cruel but not actively murderous than to grow up loyal to a system that would eventually destroy his spirit and his humanity the way it had destroyed Victor's father and grandfather and every honest man who had ever tried to live with integrity under Soviet rule. Better to be marked as the son of a man who chose freedom than to be raised as a true believer in a lie. Victor knelt beside the bed, kissed his son's forehead. Dmitri made a small sound but did not wake. His breath was soft and even. The breath of a child who believed his father would come home that evening like he came home every evening. I love you, Victor whispered in Russian. Forgive me. Those were the last words he would speak to his son for 16 years. He stood, returned to the main room. Ludmila was washing their teacups. She did not turn around when he approached. I will see you tonight, she said. Victor put on his jacket, checked his pockets one final time. Everything he would take with him fit in those pockets. One photograph, one set of identification papers that would be worthless in 12 hours. One life that would end the moment he pushed the throttle forward and turned east instead of west. I love you, he said to his wife's back. She turned then, smiled. I love you too. Fly safe. Those were the last words she would ever speak to him. Victor walked out of the apartment, down the stairs, out into the gray morning light of early September. The air was cool and damp, smelled like diesel exhaust and jet fuel, and the particular mix of industrial odors that characterized every Soviet military base. Familiar smells, the smell of the only adult life Victor had ever known. He walked to the flight line. Other pilots were arriving for the morning briefing. Victor exchanged nods, brief greetings, nothing unusual, just another training day, another standard mission. The kind of routine flight they had all done hundreds of times. The mission brief was in the squadron operations building. Captain Volkov, the flight leader, stood at the front with a map and a briefing card. 4 aircraft, standard combat air patrol, exercise over the Sea of Japan. Victor would fly as number 3 in the formation, launch at 0945. Proceed to training area Alpha 7. Conduct intercept practice against simulated targets. Return to base by 11:30. Simple, routine, exactly the kind of mission that would give Victor the opportunity he needed. Volkov went through the procedures, radio frequencies, emergency protocols, weather conditions, fuel planning, everything standard, everything normal. If he suspected anything, if any other pilot in that room had the slightest indication that Victor was planning something other than routine training, there was no sign of it. After the brief, Victor walked to his aircraft. Number 31, his regular assignment. The crew chief had it ready, pre-flight inspection complete, fueled, armed with training missiles that had no warheads. Everything in order. Victor conducted his walk-around inspection with the same methodical attention he gave every flight. Control surfaces, landing gear, air intakes, exterior panels. The aircraft was in good condition. No obvious problems. The crew chief watched him, ready to answer questions. "Anything unusual?" Victor asked. "No, sir. Aircraft is ready." "Thank you. Good hunting, sir." Victor climbed the ladder, settled into the cockpit. The seat was uncomfortable as always. Minimal padding. Soviet designers did not waste weight on pilot comfort. The instrument panel was arranged in a layout that had become second nature after 3 years. Airspeed, altitude, fuel, engine instruments, radar display, weapons panel, everything familiar. He strapped in, shoulder harness, lap belt, parachute connections. The ritual of preparation that every pilot performed before every flight. Muscle memory, automatic movements refined by repetition until they required no conscious thought. The crew chief was on the ladder now, helping with final connections. Oxygen mask, communication cord, ejection seat safety pins removed. Everything ready. "Clear to start engines, sir." Victor gave a thumbs up. The crew chief descended. Victor went through the start sequence. Right engine first. Fuel on. Ignition. The starter motor whined. The turbine began to spin. Ignition light. Fuel flow. The engine caught with a deep rumble that Victor felt through the airframe. RPM climbing. Oil pressure rising. Normal start. Left engine. Same sequence. Both engines running now. The aircraft alive and vibrating around him. Victor glanced at the other aircraft in his flight. They were starting engines. Normal procedure. Everything proceeding exactly as briefed. He looked at the photograph of Dmitri in his breast pocket one last time, before zipping the pocket closed. Then he lowered his visor and became a pilot with a mission to fly. Tower cleared them for taxi. 4 aircraft rolling in sequence toward the active runway. Victor's hands moved through the pre-takeoff checklist automatically. Flight controls, check. Trim, check. Fuel quantity, check. Weapons safe, check. Everything normal, everything about to change forever. They lined up on the runway. 2 aircraft in the first pair, Victor and his wingman in the second pair. Tower cleared them for takeoff. The first pair rolled. Victor watched them accelerate down the runway, get airborne, climb away to the north. Tower called his element. Foxbat 3-1 and 3-2 cleared for takeoff. Victor released brakes, pushed throttles forward. The engines responded with a deep roar. Acceleration pressed him back into the seat. The runway streaked past. Airspeed climbing. 100 knots. 120. 150. The nose wanted to lift. Victor held it down slightly, building speed. 180. 200. He pulled back on the stick. The nose came up. The main wheels left the ground. The MiG-25 lifted into the airs with the same brutal efficiency it did everything else. No grace, just raw power, overwhelming physics. Gear up. The wheels retracted with heavy mechanical sounds. Victor climbed following the departure procedure, joining formation with the other aircraft. They flew north. Standard route to the training area. Everything normal. Radio calls were routine. Weather was clear. Visibility unlimited. Victor checked his fuel. Full tanks. Maximum load. Shomano. He had planned this carefully. Launch with full fuel. Fly the departure route exactly as briefed. Give no indication of anything unusual until the moment of decision. Then turn east and run. They reached the training area. The flight leader began setting up the first intercept scenario. Victor acknowledged the radio calls, positioned his aircraft as directed, played his role, and waited for the right moment. It came 15 minutes into the training. The formation was spread out, aircraft separated by several miles. Volkov was setting up a simulated attack on Victor and his wingman. Standard procedure, Victor and his wingman would defend, execute evasion maneuvers, counterattack. Except Victor was not going to defend. He keyed his radio. 3-1 defensive split. The call that indicated he was breaking formation to evade the simulated attack. His wingman acknowledged. The 2 aircraft separated. Victor rolled into a descending left turn. His wingman went right. Standard tactic. But instead of leveling out and repositioning for the exercise, Victor continued the turn, brought the nose around to the east, pointed the aircraft at Japan, pushed the throttle to military power, descended toward the wave tops. The radio came alive immediately. 3-1 wrong heading. You are off course. Acknowledge. Victor reached down and switched off the radio. The silence in the cockpit was profound. Just the roar of the engines and the whistle of air over the canopy and the sound of his own breathing inside the oxygen mask. No more radio calls, no more direction from flight leaders, no more acknowledgments or standard procedures or anything that connected him to the Soviet Air Force or the life he had lived for 29 years. Just the aircraft and the ocean and the thinning fuel and the impossible distance to freedom. Victor descended to 100 feet above the water, low enough that radar would struggle to track him against the surface clutter, high enough that a moment of inattention would not send him into the waves. At this altitude, this speed, there was no margin for error. The ocean was a gray blur beneath him. The horizon ahead was empty, except for the faint line where water met sky. Behind him, somewhere in the confusion of the training area, Soviet pilots were trying to understand what had just happened. Radio calls would be frantic, flight leaders demanding position reports, base operations calling for emergency procedures, air defense networks activating, the machinery of Soviet military response grinding into motion. But Victor had several minutes before anyone understood what was really happening. Several minutes where confusion would provide him with the most valuable commodity he possessed: time. He checked his fuel flow. Maximum power at low altitude burned fuel at an enormous rate. Simple math. Distance to Japan versus fuel remaining versus burn rate. The numbers were tight, very tight. He would arrive over Japanese territory with nearly empty tanks, or he would run out of fuel over the ocean and die. There was no middle option. The flight to Japan took 37 minutes. Every one of those minutes felt like an hour. Victor's entire world contracted to the instruments and the horizon and the endless calculation of whether he had enough fuel to make it. At 15 minutes, Soviet air defense detected an unidentified track heading east at high speed. Scramble orders went out. Interceptors launched from bases along the coast. But Victor was low and fast and pulling away from Soviet airspace with every second. The interceptors would have to climb search locate, time he did not have to give them. At 20 minutes, the fuel pressure began to fluctuate. Not critical yet, but the first indication that the tanks were approaching empty. Victor eased back slightly on the throttle, trading speed for endurance. Every knot of airspeed he gave up added seconds to his flight time. Every second brought Japan closer. At 25 minutes, he could see land, a dark smudge on the horizon that gradually resolved into the coastline of Hokkaido. Mountains, forests. The northern island of Japan emerging from the haze. Almost there. The fuel warning light illuminated. Steady red glow on the panel, low fuel, very low fuel, minutes remaining at most. Victor began climbing, trading altitude for range. If the engines quit, he needed height to glide to the airport. The mathematics of desperation. Every foot of altitude was potential energy that could be converted to forward distance when the thrust died. 1,000 feet, 2,000, 3,000. The engines coughed. Fuel starvation. Brief interruption in power. Then smooth again. The tanks were nearly dry, running on vapor and fumes and the last dregs of liquid fuel sloshing in the bottom of the cells. Victor could see Hakodate now, the city spreading along the harbor, the airport visible as a clear area northeast of the urban core. 2 runways, the longer one aligned perfectly with his approach. He lined up, committed to the runway, no more options, no more choices. This was the landing or it was death. At 1 mile out, both engines quit simultaneously. The sudden silence was shocking after 40 minutes of engine roar. Just wind noise, the whistle of air through the intakes, the aircraft gliding now on momentum alone. Victor put the gear down. 3 heavy clunks, green lights, gear locked. The drag was enormous, airspeed bleeding off rapidly. He would make the runway, barely, with no power and no margin and no chance to go around if something went wrong. The runway threshold passed beneath him. He flared, held the nose up, let the sink rate decrease. The main wheels touched. Hard impact. The nose gear slammed down. Maximum braking. The aircraft shuddering and sliding and gradually slowing. and stopped, 300 feet from the end of the runway. Victor sat motionless for 5 seconds. Then his hands began to shake. Adrenaline crash. The realization of what he had just done hitting him all at once. He opened the canopy. Japanese police were already approaching, guns drawn, shouting. Victor raised his hands and spoke 3 words of English that would change the course of the Cold War. I request asylum. While Victor was surrendering to Japanese police on a civilian runway in Hakodate, 3 different governments were already moving pieces on the diplomatic chessboard that his defection had just activated. At CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, Deputy Director William Nelson was on a secure phone line to the American Embassy in Tokyo. His voice was calm, but his words were urgent. I don't care what you have to do. Stall the Soviets. Delay the Japanese. Buy us time. We need access to that aircraft, and we need it now. At the Soviet embassy in Tokyo, Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky was demanding an immediate meeting with Japanese foreign ministry officials. His prepared statement was already drafted. Stolen military property, violation of international law, immediate return required. The language was diplomatic, but the message was clear. Give us the aircraft and the pilot, or there will be consequences. At the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tokyo, senior officials were frantically trying to calculate the impossible, satisfying American intelligence interests, managing Soviet diplomatic pressure, maintaining Japan's stated neutrality, all while a Soviet MiG-25 sat on a civilian runway, creating an international incident that was growing more complex with every passing hour. But at Hakodate Airport, where all of this began, Viktor Belenko was simply sitting in a small office with Japanese police officers who had no idea what to do with a Soviet pilot who spoke no Japanese and had just landed a military aircraft without permission. Someone had found an English speaker. A local high school teacher called in to help with communication. The teacher's English was limited but functional, enough to convey basic information. You, Soviet, the teacher asked, his accent heavy but comprehensible. Victor nodded. You want America? Victor nodded again. Asylum. I want asylum. America, please. The teacher translated for the police officers. There was rapid discussion in Japanese. Phones were being used. Calls were being made. The room filled with more people. Officials, military officers, someone in a business suit who had the bearing of an intelligence officer. Within 3 hours, American embassy personnel arrived. Victor was moved to a secure location. While Victor's fate was being negotiated in diplomatic back channels that would determine the course of his future, many of you watching this lived through those tense Cold War days. Those were times when a Soviet pilot defecting with his aircraft was front-page news that sent shockwaves through both superpowers. The fear was real. The uncertainty was constant. If you remember these moments, if you recall where you were when defection news broke on the radio or television, share your memories in the comments. Your generation witnessed history that younger viewers can only read about in books. The interrogations began almost immediately. Who are you? Why did you defect? What can you tell us about the MiG-25? What are Soviet capabilities? What are their weaknesses? Victor answered every question. He had nothing to hide anymore. No loyalty to protect. The Soviet Union had taken everything from him except his life and his conscience. He would give the Americans everything they wanted to know. But there was one thing he insisted on before the detailed technical debriefings could begin. One request that was not negotiable. My family, he said through the translator, my wife and son, they will be arrested, interrogated, punished. I need your word that you will try to protect them, that you will monitor their situation, that if there is any opportunity to help them, you will take it. The CIA officer, a man who introduced himself only as Henderson, made no promises. But he made notes, and Victor saw something in the man's eyes that gave him slight hope, not certainty, not reassurance. Just the possibility that someone might remember that the pilot who handed them the Soviet Union's most secret interceptor had a 6-year-old son who would pay the price for his father's courage. At Chuguyevka Air Base, Ludmila Belenko was washing dishes when the knock came at her door. Heavy, official, the knock that every Soviet citizen feared. She dried her hands slowly, walked to the door, knew what was coming before she opened it. 2 KGB officers, Dark suits, hard faces. The younger one spoke. Ludmila Ivanovna Belenko. Yes. Your husband is Senior Lieutenant Victor Ivanovich Belenko. Yes. You need to come with us. There are questions about your husband's actions today. Dmitri appeared in the doorway behind his mother, still in his pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Mama, what is happening? Ludmila turned to her son, knelt down, took his small hands in hers. Everything will be fine, she lied. Go to Mrs. Ivanova next door. Stay with her until I come back. When will you come back? Soon. Another lie. She did not know when she would come back. Did not know if she would come back. Did not know what they would tell her son about his father or what story they would create to explain his absence. The KGB officers waited while Ludmila took Dmitri to the neighbor's apartment. Mrs. Ivanova asked no questions. Everyone knew what KGB visits meant. She simply took the boy's hand and promised to feed him lunch. Ludmila walked back to the waiting officers, got into their car. The interrogation would last 14 hours. They wanted to know everything. What Victor had said, what he had planned, who he had talked to, whether she had known, whether she had helped. She told them the truth. She had known nothing. Her husband had kissed her goodbye that morning and said he would see her that evening. Standard words, normal departure, nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, nothing that suggested he was about to steal a military aircraft and defect to the West. They did not believe her at first. But eventually, after hours of questioning, they concluded she was telling the truth. She genuinely had not known, which made her a victim of her husband's treason rather than an accomplice. She was released, returned to her apartment, found Dmitri sleeping on Mrs. Ivanova's couch, carried him home, put him to bed in his own room, and then sat at her kitchen table and cried for the first time since the KGB had knocked on her door. Her husband was gone. She did not know where, did not know if he was alive or dead, did not know if she would ever see him again. And Dmitri would wake up tomorrow and ask where Papa was. The next morning, Dmitri asked the question she had been dreading. Where is Papa? Ludmila knelt down, took his small hands in hers. Papa had to go away. For work. Far away. When will he come back? She looked into her son's eyes and told him the lie that the KGB had instructed her to tell. The lie that would poison their relationship for the next 15 years. He is not coming back, Dmitri. Papa did something bad. He left us. Dmitri's face crumpled. Papa would not leave me. You are lying. But she was not lying, not entirely. Victor had left them, for freedom, for principles, for reasons a 6-year-old could never understand. And Dmitri would grow up hating the father who abandoned him, not knowing that Victor thought about him every single day in exile, not knowing that the photograph in Victor's pocket was creased from being touched too many times, not knowing that freedom had cost his father everything that made life worth living. Not knowing. Not yet. That understanding would come 16 years later in a letter from America that would change everything Dmitri believed about his father and about himself. But that reunion was still far in the future. For now, in September 1976, there was only a 6-year-old boy crying for a father who would never come home and a mother who had to watch her son's heart break while her own was already shattered beyond repair. September 8, 1976, Hakodate Airport, northern Japan. 2 days after Victor Belenko landed aircraft number 31 on runway 23 and requested asylum in 3 carefully practiced words of English. The hangar had been cleared, secured, and cordoned off by Japanese self-defense forces working in coordination with American military intelligence. Armed guards at every entrance. No press, no unauthorized personnel. The diplomatic crisis was still raging through back channels in Tokyo, Moscow, and Washington. But inside this hangar, politics temporarily yielded to some